Thank you, FES, and yes, so many friends on the panel. It's wonderful to be here with all of you and looking forward to making new friends with people in the audience. So what I'm going to do now is dwell on the significance of village commons for sustainable and inclusive development. I'm not going to go by the general terms sustainable development, goals, indicators, or inclusive growth and inclusive development. But what I'm going to do is outline the critical role played by the commons in the lives of rural citizens and their potential for transforming livelihoods and the environment. While I focus on the significance of the commons in the here and now, it is perhaps pertinent to recall briefly the history of the commons over time, over the longue durée, because what it captures for us is the notion that the nature, extent, and even the usefulness of village commons is variable. It changes with the mode of production and the pressure of population on land, and therefore we need to consider who is affected, included, or excluded by these changes. To whom do the village commons belong then? It's a classic question posed by John Locke first, and in his view, the matter has to be considered anew every time the pressure of people on land increases and the capacity to extract resources goes up. Turning to India, the significance of the commons is most pronounced for those who have limited rights to private land, such as artisans, members of service castes, women, and itinerant pastoral nomads. To take just one concrete example, small livestock, was primarily raised by lower castes, since caste taboos prevented upper castes from raising sheep and goats. But once the taboo on small rearing was lifted, there was increasing competition within the village for pasturage, heightened by the increase in human numbers. In the post-independence period, and in the new demographic and democratic context, the matter of common pastures was debated by the legislature, as you all know, and the Gram Panchayat was made their custodian. At the level of village commons, then, it is the formal, sometimes the informal village panchayat that frames regulations for keeping livestock, for instance, from adjoining villages to come and graze in a particular village's pastures. Or, for instance, it's the panchayat again that rules that nomadic or transhumant villagers can dwell in the village commons for very short periods only. The multiple users of the commons in this way are delimited spatially, temporally, and seasonally. What comes through then is that along with the rhetoric of the commons as sarvajanik or public, as practiced, the commons speak an evolving language of both exclusion and inclusion. At the same time, the Indian state too, through acts of converting and reclassifying land, has extended its sway over village commons. It has privatized tracts and regularized encroachments. However, judicial interventions by the Supreme Courts on this question have recognized time and again that common tracts should not be privatized. This was reiterated in 2011 by a two-member bench of the Supreme Court, which argued that even these common lands, misclassified and built upon by muscle and money power, should be returned to the commons fold, and we'll hear more about it in the afternoon from Shalini. Our judiciary, of course, has a wonderful tradition of upholding the environmental public interest. It's also called our best environmental activist. But the implementation of its decisions is a different ballgame altogether. Every documentation on the commons has noted that, that it takes about 15 years to evict somebody formally on an average, and the commons area has declined despite laws and judgments to the contrary. Strong deterrence and swift punishment for encroachers is the call of the hour. but I can't do better than really quote a villager from Rajasthan who said that the resistance is most needed before a building comes up, because it is extremely difficult to pull it down once an investment has been made, never mind the law. The need to visualize the boundaries of the commons with pillars, well, for transparency, has been reiterated instead of simply surveying, codifying, and recording on paper alone. And yet, all is still not lost. And so I shall touch on the existing, yes, still existing potential of village commons for sustainable and inclusive development. On the ground, environmental, economic, and social sustainability are certainly merged, they're intertwined. And this is also actually the synergy that is mandated for the new sustainable development goals as well. And so I shall simply enumerate and underscore the valuable dimensions of village commons as I see them even now. First and foremost, village commons, they signal a domain of shared norms vis-à-vis relationships and resources. Village commons are interestingly endowed with names, each different patch, constituted and textured through language and local practices. These practices are public, social, and intergenerational. Here, villagers exist core villagers. They can and do forge bridges across class and caste divides. In this reckoning, it is the principle of the commons that remains stable and not the object that is constant. Secondly, the commons recenter the social margins in specific ways. These are spaces for employing older men, older women, and even the handicapped as graziers, for instance. Such practices perform a sort of social justice, enabled because the home and the resource are located nearby. These sites also double up as spaces for itinerant performers, ironsmiths, and other service providers. Third, village commons meet small requirements of food, fuel, medicinal plants, forages, timber, water, and other use values that help to mitigate poverty. You've just heard about it, and I don't need to elaborate. But I do want to reiterate that the ephemeral annual vegetation of the commons often comes alive in the rainy season, and this is critical for livestock. You know, in economic jargon, this has got a very high-sounding phrase, a natural grazing-based livestock production system. The active nurture of biodiversity in these tracts can certainly strengthen both ecological and economic dimensions. Village commons, again, also provide spaces where small, inclusive, and socially sustainable developments can be put into practice, such as reservoirs for rainwater harvesting or corridors for fauna. And in fragile common tracts in mountain and desert areas, for instance, the work of ecological restoration, climate protection, and post-Anthropocene concerns have and are being taken up. Finally, India is committed to such principles as sustainable development, inclusive growth, the precautionary principle, and now the sustainable development goals that emerge from international forums. These principles, too, operate as external forces acting upon village commons, which then become experimental sites that show up new state effects and changing horizons. And so, to conclude, yes, village commons, composed of the bric-a-brac of people, flora, and fauna, are still critical as life-sustaining assemblages that invoke inclusive sharing and sustainable dialogues and developments at the margins of private property. Thank you.
Thank you very much.